There's a version of Marty Raney that millions of people think they know. The weathered man with the gray beard and the steady hands who shows up on screen, sizes up a failing homestead in about 30 seconds, and immediately starts solving problems that have been defeating other people for months. He drills wells, he lays stone, he builds walls that look like they belong in a different century. He talks about Alaska the way most people talk about a first love, like it chose him just as much as he chose it. Audiences have spent years watching him and walking away feeling like they know exactly who he is. But the man behind the television image is someone far more complicated, far more accomplished, and honestly far more interesting than anything a one-hour reality show has ever had time to reveal. Because what Homestead Rescue never fully tells you is how Marty Raney became Marty Raney. The real story starts decades before the cameras showed up, and it starts with a teenager making a decision that most people in his life probably thought was a catastrophic mistake. Marty Raney was born on October 16, 1957, in North Bend, Washington, a small town about 30 miles east of Seattle, sitting right at the foot of the Cascade Mountains. It's the kind of place where the wilderness isn't a destination, it's the backdrop of everyday life. And for Marty, growing up in what he's described as the last house on Mount C Road, with the nearest neighbor about a mile away, that backdrop became everything. This wasn't a suburban childhood. There were no weekend camping trips or nature documentaries to romanticize the outdoors. The outdoors was just where you lived and what you did. From a young age, Marty was hiking the surrounding forests, fishing local rivers, and learning the Cascades not as a tourist, but as someone who belonged there. By 12 or 13 years old, he was independently hiking from Goldmire Hot Springs all the way to Stevens Pass, 35 miles through the Cascades on his own. That kind of early self-reliance doesn't come from a classroom. It comes from being trusted to figure things out and proving, repeatedly, that you can. His upbringing was also rooted in the work ethic of homesteading before homesteading was a lifestyle brand. Clearing land, chopping wood, feeding animals, these were daily realities, not weekend projects. And while North Bend gave him the foundation, something in Marty was already reaching further north. Something bigger was calling. At just 16 years old, he quit school and left home. Not because things were terrible at home and not out of rebellion for its own sake, but because he'd already spotted the horizon he wanted to chase. He was heading to Alaska, and in the 1970s, for a teenager with almost nothing in his pocket, that was about as bold a move as a person could make. The first time Marty ever saw Alaska from the air is a story he's told more than once, because it's too good not to tell. He was flying to Ketchikan and happened to run into a friend named Dwayne Tibbles, who worked for Alaska Airlines. The friend pulled him out of his regular seat and let him ride in the cockpit of the 737. The view from that cockpit, the rivers, the mountains, the wilderness rolling endlessly below, left a mark that never faded. Marty has credited that moment with cementing his desire to pursue the Alaskan lifestyle. He says to this day he's never forgotten the role that chance encounter played in shaping the rest of his life. He landed in Alaska as a teenager and started doing what you do in Southeast Alaska in the 1970s when you need work and you've got a strong back. He went into logging. The camps he worked in weren't glamorous. They were remote, physically brutal, and entirely disconnected from the comforts most young people his age were enjoying back in the lower 48. But Marty wasn't most young people. He was exactly where he wanted to be. In 1974, Marty married Molly Rostel, a woman from Washington who was apparently just as willing as he was to trade conventional life for something wilder. The two of them began their married life in the logging camps of Southeast Alaska, and their very first home as a couple was not on land at all. It was a floating logging camp off the coast of Prince of Wales Island. No electricity, no running water, no plumbing, no heat in any conventional sense. Just two young people building a life from the ground, or rather the water, up. A year later, they moved to a 160-acre homestead in Haines, Alaska, 100 miles from the nearest town, completely off the grid, surrounded by some of the highest concentrations of Alaskan brown bears in the entire state. The kind of place where your survival isn't theoretical. It's a daily negotiation with the environment. A few years after that, they relocated again to another remote floating logging camp, this time 100 air miles from the coastal fishing town of Sitka. Every move was deeper into the wilderness, further from convenience, and closer to the kind of life Marty had always been reaching for. What's easy to overlook in all of this is Molly. While Marty is the face most people recognize, the woman standing behind every chapter of this story has been there for every one of them. She never appears on Homestead Rescue. She stays largely out of the public eye. But she's worked as the accountant for Alaska Stone and Log, the family construction business for decades, and she's the one keeping the homestead running every time Marty is out filming. They married in 1974 and are still together. In a world where fame and television have a well-documented way of destroying relationships, that kind of quiet, enduring partnership deserves more recognition than it gets. By the mid-1980s, the Raneys had 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, Melanie, Miles, Misty, and Matt, and the family had moved roughly 800 miles further north into Alaska. These children did not grow up the way most American kids grow up. They grew up in the family construction business, Alaska Stone and Log, learning to peel logs and quarry stone before most of their peers had ever touched a power tool. They went on annual moose, caribou, and sheep hunts as a family. They dip-netted salmon together. They hiked, skied, and explored the Alaskan wilderness as naturally as other families go to the mall. The business Marty built, Alaska Stone and Log, became a genuine legacy operation. Working with natural materials, using the simplest tools, building cabins and structures designed to last generations. It wasn't a side project or a hobby. It was the livelihood that kept his family fed and his skills sharp through all the years before anyone outside Alaska had heard his name. And it left what Discovery Channel's bio of him describes as a legacy of craftsmanship spread across the entire state. Marty didn't talk much publicly about the philosophy behind all of this until the show gave him a platform to do so. But when he did, it was clear this wasn't a performance of values. It was the thing itself. His quote to Fox News in a 2017 interview cuts straight to what drives him. What made America was the homesteader, the people who built their own homes. Those people built this country. Hard workers, people not afraid to roll up their sleeves. Here's the part of Marty Raney's biography that most of his television audience has never fully absorbed, and it's frankly remarkable. Before Discovery Channel, before National Geographic, before any camera ever pointed in his direction, Marty Raney was one of Alaska's most accomplished mountain guides. He climbed Denali for the first time in 1986. That's North America's highest peak at 20,320 feet, and it is not a mountain that tolerates inexperience or ego. He didn't just climb it once and put it on a resume. He began guiding 21-day climbing expeditions up Denali and eventually started his own guiding company in 1998. He made the first ever cell phone call from Denali's summit, a footnote that sounds like trivia until you sit with the kind of combination of technical skill, determination, and timing that moment required. And then there is the family record that stands completely alone. The Raneys, Marty, Molly, and all 4 children, are the only family of 6 in which every member has climbed Denali multiple times. A husband, a wife, and 4 kids who have all summited North America's highest peak more than once. That's not an adventure story. That's a statement about how an entire family was raised. His film career during this period is equally overlooked. Before Homestead Rescue, Marty had already appeared in multiple documentaries in various roles, as a Denali climbing guide, as a second cameraman, as a sound man, and consistently as a musician performing at altitude. He appeared in the BBC travel documentary An Idiot Abroad as a guide. He was involved in multiple Denali climbing films, including the high one, Against All Odds on PBS, and the Japanese documentary series The Great Summit Series. He wasn't a background figure in these productions. He was central to them, and yes, he played music in them, on mountaintops, with an audience of snow and sky. Because here's the other thing most people don't know about Marty Raney. The man is a serious musician. He's a songwriter and guitarist who has written and performed songs about Alaska, homesteading, and the wilderness for decades. He designed and built the only guitar in existence shaped like the state of Alaska. Tracks like Alaska Tattooed Lady and You Never Wrote reveal a creative side that is genuinely funny, genuinely skilled, and completely at odds with the stoic survivalist image the show tends to project. Music, for Marty, isn't a party trick. It's a deeply woven part of who he is. Marty Raney did not walk into an audition. He didn't hire a manager or pitch himself to a network. Television found him the way it finds people worth finding, by showing up where he already was, doing exactly what he'd always done. National Geographic came to Alaska scouting survivalists for their new show Ultimate Survival Alaska. Marty fit what they were looking for so perfectly that he went on to film 36 episodes across 3 seasons. It was his first real exposure to a national audience, and it expanded his reputation from well-known in Alaska to something considerably larger. Prior to that show, he was known regionally as an all-around survival guy, someone who could handle anything the wilderness threw at him. Television simply broadcast that reality to a much wider room. Discovery Channel paid attention. By 2016, Homestead Rescue was on air, and Marty was its undeniable anchor. The premise was both simple and genuinely useful. Real families across America struggling to make off-grid homesteading actually work, getting rescued by a man who had been living that exact life for 40 years. No theory, no guesswork, just experience walking in the door and getting to work. The show immediately connected. It became one of Discovery's most consistent performers across more than a decade, running into double-digit seasons and spawning a spin-off called Raney Ranch, which followed the family as they built their own homestead on their 40-acre property in Alaska, a piece of land only accessible by crossing a raging Class 4 river. The property is so remote that getting to it requires crossing a river that would end most people's interest in living there entirely. For Marty, it was the obvious choice. As he explained to a reporter who asked him how Discovery came to choose him, "I think this is why Discovery tuned in on me. I had this long history of living all over Alaska, a lot of it remote and unique. I think Discovery liked the fact that my family had an adventurous, ongoing Alaskan history happening." Understatement of a career. With success comes scrutiny, and Homestead Rescue got its fair share. Not long after the show launched, a couple named Kim and Josh Zabek, who had appeared in the second episode of Season 1, filed a lawsuit that forced a public conversation about what reality television actually shows versus what is real. The Zabeks owned Revolutionary Roots Farm and were, by their own account, experienced and capable homesteaders. They appeared on the show after pigs had damaged a portion of their property, but when the episode aired, they felt they had been portrayed as amateurs who didn't know what they were doing, which they said was simply not true. Their lawsuit alleged that production had misled them about how they would be represented, telling them they'd be shown as established homesteaders. What aired was something quite different. Their case opened a door that other participants walked through. A couple named Ren and Eni, who appeared in Season 2, also came forward with their account. Their experience was more nuanced. They weren't angry, and they said the Raneys themselves were genuine and helpful, but they confirmed that certain elements were exaggerated for the cameras. The mold shown dramatically on screen was actually soot from a stovepipe, and the log cabin that appeared to have been built by the Raneys was actually constructed by a separate company, a pastor and a community of homesteaders from his church. Hundreds of hours of footage were filmed. Not all of it made the final cut, and what the final cut showed wasn't always the full picture. The Raney family has consistently maintained that the show is unscripted and authentic. Marty himself has said more than once that nothing is contrived once the cameras are rolling, that you simply cannot fake what happens when real people are placed in real wilderness. And looking at the broader picture of his life, that's a hard argument to dismiss. This is not a man performing a character, but the lawsuits raised a legitimate question that applies to every reality show ever made. When a production company controls what gets edited into 42 minutes of television, how much reality actually survives the process? The show never collapsed under the weight of that question. It kept going. The audience kept watching. Whatever damage the controversy might have caused, it didn't show up in the ratings. But it did leave a permanent asterisk in the public record, a reminder that even the most authentic-seeming television is still television. Season after season, Marty Raney showed up on other people's homesteads and fixed what was broken. He taught other families how to survive fires and floods and failed infrastructure. He rebuilt things that had fallen apart. He always had the answer. And then 2021 arrived and reminded everyone, including Marty, that expertise and experience don't make you immune. First came the fire. The Raneys' personal cabin on their 40-acre Hatcher Pass property was destroyed in a blaze that was significant enough to be chronicled on the show itself. The man who had spent years helping other families rebuild after disasters watched his own home burn. There's a particular brutality in that kind of irony, not because it's unusual for difficult things to happen to people who handle difficulty for a living, but because it strips away any remaining distance between the television persona and the actual human being underneath. Then came the fall. Also in 2021, Marty suffered a significant injury after falling from a tree while working. The details weren't extensively publicized, but the fact of the injury was confirmed, and at 63 or 64 years old, working in remote Alaskan conditions, a fall serious enough to require recovery is not a minor thing. It's the kind of setback that tests whether the resilience you've been preaching to other people for years is actually something you carry in yourself, or whether it was always just a story you told on television. Marty got back up, he rebuilt the cabin, he returned to the show, he kept working. The answer, it turned out, was that the resilience was real. But 2021 will always stand as the year when the man who made his name rescuing other people's homesteads had to apply every lesson he'd ever taught to his own front door. There is a version of Marty Raney that exists completely independent of television, and it may actually be the most complete version. He published Homestead Survival: An Insider's Guide to Your Great Escape, a book that takes 5 decades of genuine off-grid knowledge and makes it accessible to anyone willing to do the work. This wasn't a ghost-written celebrity product designed to capitalize on a TV deal. It was a practical manual written by someone who has lived every word of it in one of the harshest climates on the planet. The book addresses emergency preparedness, self-reliance, and off-grid construction from a perspective that no amount of research or imagination can substitute for. His music career runs parallel to everything else. He's been writing and performing songs about Alaska and wilderness life for as long as he's been building cabins. The guitar shaped like the state of Alaska, which he designed and built himself, is the kind of detail that sounds almost too on brand until you realize it's just completely in character. This is a man who doesn't do things halfway. If he's going to build a guitar, it's going to be the only guitar shaped like Alaska in the world. His work as a documentary filmmaker and expedition musician across the 1990s and 2000s, guiding climbs, handling cameras, performing at altitude, built a body of work that most of his current television audience has no idea exists. The BBC, PBS, National Geographic, and Japanese documentary teams all recognized something in Marty Raney long before Discovery Channel came calling. He was already a multi-dimensional figure before fame had any reason to flatten him into a single one.